students, hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. Today I am going to talk about a general topic, that is pollination. In this lecture, I'll try to make you understand number 1, what is pollination? Number 2, what is direct and indirect pollination? Number 3, what is self and cross-pollination? Number 4, what are the various contrivances for self and cross-pollination? Number 5, what are the advantages of self and cross-pollination? Number 6, what are the limitations of self and cross-pollination? Number 7, what are the various agencies of pollination? Number 8, what are the various types of pollination based on the agents involved in pollen transport? Dear students, pollination is an extraordinarily important event in the sexual reproduction of flowering plants. The process of pollination is of tremendous significance to seed-bearing plants, as it is extraordinarily vital for the seed and fruit formation in such plants. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same or a different flower. The process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same or different flower, but on the same or different specific plant, is known as pollination. Pollination refers to the landing and subsequent germination of pollen on the stigma. In angiosperms, since pollen lands on the stigma, it is referred to as indirect pollination, while as in gymnosperms, pollen directly lands on the ovule, hence it is referred to as direct pollination. Based on the destination of pollen grains, pollination is fundamentally of two types. Number 1, self-pollination, and number 2, cross-pollination. First of all, let's see what self-pollination is. Self-pollination is that pollination in which the pollen is transferred from anther to stigma of the same flower or stigma of a different flower on the same plant. Self-pollination involving the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of the same flower is called as autogamy, while as the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of a different flower on the same plant is called as geitonogamy. This geitonogamy is genetically conceived to be self-pollination, as both the paternal and maternal partner has the same genetic composition or are genetically identical. However, ecologists deem it as cross-pollination. Self-pollination involves a single plant. Autogamy is that pollination in which pollen moves from anther to stigma of the same flower. This autogamy is favored by bisexuality of flowers. It's only possible in those plants which bear bisexual, hermaphrodite or perfect flowers, which are also homogamous. Means they are with both male and female sex organs achieving maturation at the same time. An extreme floral adaptation for autogamy or self-pollination is the formation of cleistogamous flowers. These cleistogamous flowers are bisexual flowers which do not open at all, thus bringing about self-fertilization, phenomena referred to as the cleistogamy. The well-known examples of cleistogamy include Commelina, Viola, etc. One more important floral phenomenon which favors or promotes self-pollination or autogamy is the movement of sex organs towards each other. In many plants, autogamy or self-pollination is promoted by bending or movement of sex organs, that is stamen and carpel, towards one another. There are certain advantages of self-pollination, or we can say there are certain merits of this self-pollination. This self-pollination assures fertilization and seed set. There is no pollen wastage. Pollen-ovule ratio is very low and pollination is certain. There is no wastage of energy or resources for pollinator attraction. Purity of race is maintained and no unwanted characters creep into the progeny. But dear students, this self-pollination has certain disadvantages as well. Like it leads to the reduction in genetic variation. The offsprings are less vigorous. The progeny we get is less resistant to diseases and other types of stresses. Due to less genetic variability, the self-pollinating species have low adaptability to changed climate or changed environment and other hazards. In this, no new characters are added to the progeny. Now, we come to the second type of pollination, that is cross-pollination. Pollination in which pollen is transferred from anther to stigma of a different flower born on another plant of the same species is called as cross-pollination. It is also known as xenogamy. This type of pollination always occurs between flowers of genetically different plants. The angiosperms have evolved various floral features which promote the cross-pollination. These include unisexuality, dichogamy, hercogamy, heterostyle, self-sterility, pollen prepotency, etc. So, let us briefly talk about these outbreeding devices which enforce cross-pollination in otherwise bisexual flowers or hermaphrodite plants. First, unisexuality or dichogamy. In angiosperms, there are 4% species in which male and female flowers are born on separate plants. Such plants are called as dioecious plants. In dioecious plants, cross-pollination is the rule, as the male and female unisexual flowers are born on separate plants, thus leaving no chance for self-pollination to occur. Then there is dichogamy. It is a mechanism to prevent self-pollination and promote cross-pollination in bisexual flowers. Dichogamy refers to the phenomenon where male and female sex organs in a flower mature at different times. When anthers mature first, it is called as protandry, for example, in Saxifraga. On the other hand, when gynoecium or pistil matures first, it is called as protogyny, as in Magnolia and Plantago. We also have hercogamy. Here, the structure of male and female sex organs acts as a barrier for self-pollination and thus favors cross-pollination. For example, in some plants, stamens are short and pistil is very long, and thus they are spatially separated from the anthers. This spatial separation of sex organs acts as a barrier for pollen transfer from stamen to the stigma. For example, in Gloriosa, the anthers dehisce at a distance so that the stigma is out of the reach of its own pollen. Then we have Heterostyle. It is also a morphological adaptation which is aimed at preventing self-pollination and promoting cross-pollination. In plants which show this mechanism, the flowers may be of two or more types or morphs with regard to mainly the length of the style and length of the stamens, and pollen from a flower can bring about effective pollination in flowers of a different type and not within its own type. The best example of Heterostyle is presented by primrose, that is Primula vulgaris. It shows distyle, that is it has two different types of flowers. One called as pin-eyed or long-styled with long style and short stamens, and the other as thrum-eyed or short-styled with short style and long stamens. In such plants, pollen from one morph can pollinate the stigma of the other form and not flowers of its own morph. Then we also have self-sterility. Self-sterility is a genetic and biochemical mechanism where viable pollen of a flower is incapable of bringing about fertilization in the same flower. All such plants in which a viable pollen of a flower is incapable of bringing about fertilization and seed set in the same flower are said to be self-incompatible or self-sterile. It is a strong mechanism to prevent self-pollination in plants and favor the cross-pollination. Dear students, like we saw in self-pollination, this cross-pollination also has certain advantages or merits. The cross-pollination gives rise to vigorous, strong and healthy offsprings. The plants produced through cross-pollination are more resistant to disease. Cross-pollination leads to heterozygosity and increased genetic variability, which consequently increases the adaptability of the offsprings towards changes in the environment or climate change. The cross-pollination results in the production of offsprings which are better than the parents because of the hybrid vigor. New desirable characters can be introduced in the progeny. Cross-pollination is useful in improving the crops and also for production of new useful varieties of different crops like fruits and vegetables. But at the same time, the cross-pollination also has certain disadvantages. As we can see, this cross-pollination is very expensive. A lot of resources are wasted on producing flower color, odor and nectar for attracting the pollinators. Cross-pollination is associated with a lot of uncertainty as the external agency is involved. So, the chance factor is always there. The wastage of pollen is much more as it depends on the external agents. Wastage of pollen is more in Anemophily, that is wind pollination, than the other types of pollination. In this, there is a possibility of introduction of undesirable characters in the progeny. Now, we come to the last part of this lecture, that is the agents of pollination. We know that sexual reproduction in animals is brought about by the active participation of the male and female individuals which move towards each other for bringing about the same. Plants being sedentary, even the male flowers or male organs have no internal device to reach the female organs in another flower. For this, they are dependent on some external agency which mostly transfers pollen grains from the male parent to the stigma in the female parent. These are known as pollinating agencies. There are two types of agents which bring about this transfer of pollen grains from male organ to the female organs in plants. These are number 1, abiotic agents which include non-living factors such as wind and water. And the pollination brought about by these non-living factors is called as abiotic pollination. And number 2, there are biotic agents which include organisms such as birds, bats, insects like bees, butterflies and moths. Pollination brought about by living organisms is called as biotic pollination. Abiotic pollination, what is it? It is brought about by non-living sources. It is further categorized as anemophily and hydrophily. Anemophily is the pollination carried about by the wind. It is an abiotic means of pollination and being non-directional, a wasteful process. Wind is the most primitive and less efficient pollination agency as considerable amount of pollen are lost during the pollination process. That the pollen would reach the right stigma with wind is a hit and miss affair. Therefore, to enhance the probability of pollen reaching the right stigma and to compensate the loss of pollen during the transit, anemophilous plants produce huge quantities of pollen as compared to the entomophilous plants. The anemophilous plants are characterized by certain features like the flowers are colorless, odorless and nectarless. They are also inconspicuous and relatively small with absence or reduction of non-essential parts. The pollen grains in them are light, small and dusty so that they can be blown easily by the wind. Their pollen are dry and non-sticky. The flowers are borne in drooping catkins and have stigma that is feathery or branched to catch the wind-borne pollen grains. This anemophily is characterized by the reduction in the number of ovules per ovary. In grasses, there is only one ovule per ovary. The most common examples of anemophilous plants are willow, walnut, maize, rice, wheat, mulberry, cannabis, etc. Then we have another type of pollination after anemophily, that is hydrophily. Pollination carried out by water is known as hydrophily. It's not common in nature. This type of pollination occurs in some aquatic plants at the surface of water or inside water. It's rare among the hydrophytes which are mostly pollinated by wind and insects. Hydrophilous plants are characterized by few important features like their flowers are small and inconspicuous. They either lack floral envelopes completely or if present, it's highly reduced. Nectar and odor are absent in water pollinated flowers. Stigma is long, sticky but unwettable. In Hydrophili, the pollen grains are carried by water and when they reach the stigma, they coil around it and germinate. Hydrophili is of two types. One is epihydrophily. Surface pollination or epihydrophily is the pollination occurring on the surface of water. It includes plants which are pollinated on the surface of water as we can see in Vallisneria. And then another type of hydrophily is hypohydrophily. Hypohydrophily is underwater pollination or submerged pollination. It includes plants which are pollinated inside the water as in Ceratophyllum and Zostera. Now we come to the biotic pollination. Pollination where the pollen transfer is brought about by living organisms is called as biotic pollination. Only 10% of flowering plants are pollinated without animal assistance and about 80% of all plant pollination is biotic. Based on the type of pollinator, the biotic pollination is of many types. 1. Entomophily, 2. Ornithophily, 3. Chiropterophily and 4. Malacophily. First, entomophily. When pollination is brought about by insects, it's known as entomophily. It is the most common mode of biotic pollination. This entomophily includes melitophily, that is pollination by bees, psychophily, pollination by butterflies, myophily, that is the pollination by flies, cantherophily, that is pollination done by beetles, phalinophily, that is pollination by moths, and myrmecophily, that is pollination by ants. Of the various insects, bees are the main flower visitors and handle up to 80% of all pollination done by the insects. The characteristics of entomophilous flowers are, they are brightly colored as we see in viola. These small flowers become conspicuous by their grouping into large inflorescences as we can see in the capitulum of Helianthus, that is common sunflower, and Tagetes, that is the marigold. Where the petals are not conspicuous, other parts become showy. For example, bracts in bougainvillea and leaves in euphorbia. Certain flowers produce nectar secreting glands called nectaries. Specific nectar collecting insects enter into the flower and thus carry the pollen grains from one flower to another. Nectar is an important food for insects. Sometimes nectar is contained in a special structure called as spur, as we find in Impatiens balsamina, that is the common garden balsam. Most of the insect pollinated flowers have a landing platform. In many cases, special markings occur on the petal for guiding the insects to nectar glands. These are called as honey or nectar guides, as we can see in viola. Edible pollen are produced by some entomophilous plants like rosa, clematis, magnolia, etc. Smell or odor is an important adaptation of entomophilous flowers. The smell or Odor is used as an important attractant by nocturnal entomophilous flowers which bloom and emit smell at night to attract insects when the color of the flower has no role for attraction, as in cestrum, that is the night queen, and jasminum, the common jasmine. Pollen grains in insect pollinated flowers are produced in small numbers in comparison to the wind pollinated flowers. Their pollen grains are sticky and rough so that they are held on the legs or wings of the insects. In Calotropis, pollen grains occur as pollinia. Now, let us mention some special cases of entomophily. In an orchid, Ophrys spiculum, pollination occurs by act of pseudocopulation. Trapdoor mechanism of pollination occurs in ficus species whose pollination is carried out by a wasp known as blastophaga. Turnpipe mechanism or lever mechanism operates in salvia pollinated by bees. Flytrap mechanism is also present in Aristolochia, arum, etc. Now, we have ornithophily. It is the transfer of pollen grains with the help of birds. In some parts of the tropics, birds are most important pollinators than insects. Small birds with long pointed beak suck nectar from the flowers and bring about the pollination. Ornithophilous flowers are usually tubular, cup-shaped or urn-shaped, brightly colored with large quantities of pollen and plenty of nectar. Hummingbirds, sunbirds and honey-eaters are some of the birds which regularly visit flowers. Nicotiana and Callistemon are the common examples of ornithophilous plants. The another type of pollination is Chiropterophily. It is pollination which occurs with the help of bats. These bats are the instrumental pollinators only in tropics. Chiropterous flowers are borne singly or in clusters quite away from branches and foliage owing to their long stalks. These flowers open only at or after dusk. They are dull in color and emit strong odors. Margravia avinia, a newly discovered Cuban rainforest vine, has developed a distinctively shaped concave leaf next to its flowers, which is believed to be a reminiscent of a dish reflector. This leaf acts as an ideal echo beacon, sending back strong multidirectional echoes with an easily recognizable and unvarying acoustic signature, perfect for making the flower obvious to echolocating bats. This echo beacon benefits both the bats and the vine. It enhances the foraging efficiency of bats and thus enhances the number of visits received by the plant for materializing its pollination. Then we have some other types of pollination like Abiophily, that is the pollination by snakes, Myrmecophily, pollination by ants, and Malacophily, pollination by snails. Dear students, with this we come to the end of today's lecture. I take your leave and hope to see you soon in the next one. Thank you.